Hello and welcome. Our world is in the fastest, deepest and widest recession since the Great Depression of the 1930s. Getting out of this great shutdown calls for imaginative, innovative government and corporate policy maneuvering at a scale that hasn't been seen in the history of mankind. Making sense of the collapsing world around us requires deep thinking and rigorous analysis which goes way beyond any established policy framework. My guest today is the world's best known business commentator, the legendary editor of the Financial Times Daily, Mr. Martin Wolf. The smartest business executives globally listen intently to every word that comes out of his mouth and every article he pens to draw meaning in a rapidly changing world. I am delighted and privileged to introduce to this India Today E-Conclave session the Chief Economics Editor of the Financial Times, Mr. Martin Wolf. Mr. Wolf, welcome.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.
You wrote a book on the last financial crisis, which was called The Shift and the Shocks. How does this crisis compare in its intensity with what you've studied going back in time?
So it's fundamentally different in its origin and nature. This is very important to understand, and this should shape the way it evolves. But in its intensity, that is, say, just measured by the scale of the economic declines we now expect. And of course, this is very early. We don't know what's going to happen yet. We're at the beginning of the collapse phase for most economies. But it seems pretty clear that the output declines in the world economy will be enormously much greater. The IMF expects that the world economy will shrink about 3% this year. I think that's far too optimistic. But in the financial crisis, it didn't shrink as a whole at all. In the developed countries, it shrunk by about 3%. Now the IMF's forecast is that it will shrink by about 6%, so twice as much. And these are the most optimistic possible assumptions. It's very plausible and very credible assumptions that the decline in output this time will be much greater than this, in which case, just measured in terms of the intensity of its effects on real output, it's clearly the biggest decline since the Great Depression. And in its speed, it exceeds the Great Depression itself very, very considerably.
At this moment, globally, countries face a tough choice between extending the total lockdown, lifting restrictions partially, or saying we'll take the virus in the chest because the cure cannot be worse than the disease. How do you look at this Sophie's choice, and what do you think is the best way forward?
Well, first of all, I do think it varies by country because the options countries have for managing it differ. The extent to which they can cushion the pain for individuals and business varies very much. Their capacity to actually make a lockdown work varies very much, depends on living conditions. But that said, I basically think this choice is a false one. I think it's a mistaken choice. I don't think of it as containment of the disease versus the economy. I think of it as containment of the disease and the economy. Why do I think this? This is a really important point, which is now increasing analysis. The point is, if we just let the disease run rampant through our societies, that would first impose huge economic costs. Large parts of the labor force would not be able to work. There will be enormous medical costs associated with managing such a disease, and these are really enormous costs. But just as important, people wouldn't just go back to work. Far from it. People wouldn't go back out to buy. People wouldn't be going to the shops. People wouldn't be traveling. So with a rampant, uncontrolled disease, the costs both directly, I'm leaving aside the cost of lives, the costs directly in medical care and the economic costs would be enormous. It's not at all clear we could get back to anything like a normal economy. Now, let's suppose we contain it effectively and keep it contained. over, let's say we have 2 months of shutdown, lockdown, whatever you call it. Then we have effective policy, which not all countries can do, of testing, tracing, quarantine, so the disease remains very subdued or even eliminated in society, as in South Korea. Then the economy can go fairly well back to normal, leaving aside the international problems we have anyway. So my view is that this is a false choice, that provided you can make the shutdowns or lockdowns really work to contain the disease and keep it contained, that's the best policy medically, and it's also the best policy for the economy.
In an article you wrote recently for the Financial Times, you said that desperate times call for desperate measures. What are the kind of economic measures you'd like to see a country like India take to exit from this great shutdown?
Well, the broad measures that we need to see are obviously twofold, perhaps threefold. First, perhaps it's best to break it down into. First, you have to use all the medical resources you have and that you can create to deal with the medical side of the disease. Obviously, we all know India has a relatively limited health system by the standards of the richer countries. So this is going to be quite a challenge, clearly. But you need, and you can't create all this for overnight. So you have to deal with that side of it. And then you have to protect people who are dramatically affected and damaged. Their livelihoods are removed from them in the economy from the consequences. And again, in the developed world now, rightly, we have put in place enormously expensive policies to support people's incomes while they're not working, to keep people attached to their employer by paying for short-time work or furloughed workers, and of course support to companies so they survive. That is essentially aimed at ensuring that people's welfare continues to be supported. They can continue to live, buy food, or pay rent, all these other things, and that there is an economy to go back to. That's what you want to do. This is enormously expensive, and we expect fiscal deficits in the developed world. In my view, they're going to go to 10% of GDP or well over. Public debt will rise enormously, and we have to accept that. I actually believe that India does have the room very substantially to expand its fiscal deficits in this crisis. India's public finances are largely, almost entirely, self-financed by Indians themselves. And I think India needs to run a very large fiscal deficit. But clearly, the capacity of India to do the same for its huge population as, say, Britain or Germany is able to do is smaller, and they're much more painful choices for the government to make.
Now, virtually every sector of the Indian economy has been hard hit by the pandemic crisis. Corporates after corporates are seeking bailouts and financial stimulus. As you mentioned, government resources are stretched and they are limited. How would you advocate the Indian government distribute its limited resources at a time when every sector is clamoring for help?
Well, I suppose my view is if the Indian government has made the fundamental decision that it must contain the pandemic, that it must essentially suppress the pandemic. This is an immensely heroic decision to take in a country of the complexity and scale of India. But if you've made that decision, the necessary condition for making that work at all is that you support the people's livelihood. If people can't go out to work, all the people who used to work in the informal economy all over the country, they can't be expected to stay home and starve to death. They have to live off something. So it seems to me the first priority is to support the living standards of the people. The second thing, obviously, is to support companies. I mean, my own view in India would be, because in any case this doesn't work very well, put a halt on all bankruptcy proceedings. All that basically has to be forgotten. Companies must be supported, And the government should encourage, probably through guarantees of some kind, perhaps very large ones, banks to continue to support companies, to continue to give them the money they need to buy the essential requirements of continued functioning where they can function at all, through the crisis, on the assumption it's not going to be too long. At the end of this, there will be some businesses which will have been completely devastated because they will have actually no customers at all for a long period. I'm thinking of the tourism industry. I think at the end of this, what the government will have to do is look at those industries, perhaps in the process, and see what sort of bailouts are appropriate, or whether there has to be a debt restructuring and how the debt restructuring has to be done. But I think the essential requirements are supporting the living standards of the people and making sure that there is enough finance to keep what look like basically in normal circumstances viable businesses afloat till the reckoning when the economy starts to come back and we can start to see what sort of damage there is.
So I want to tell our viewers that we invited you to send us live questions which we promised to put to Martin Wolf, and we've received a lot of questions already. You can send us questions still. Our teams have all the social media accounts open. We're seeing what you're saying and we'll try and put those questions to Martin Wolf over the next few minutes. My first question is from one of India's leading economists from the Aditya Birla Group, Ajit Ranade, who talks about the debate around capitalism being rigged. He says, do you believe, Mr. Wolf, that there is a need for a radical overhaul of capitalism itself? Former Reserve Bank of India Governor Raghuram Rajan said, we need to save capitalism from capitalists.
Yes, I wrote a review of that book. This is now a good 15 years ago. This issue seems to me quite separate from our crisis. We would have a crisis, whatever economic system we have, it seems to me, simply from the way the pandemic has unfolded. But yes, I do think that there are deeper, longer run questions about how capitalism has been operating. I've focused largely on the developed countries, where it seems to me we clearly have a number of questions about corporate governance, the role of finance in determining the shape of corporate governance, how the domination of the financial considerations, the tendency towards monopoly, and the need for a very, very powerful competition policy, concerns about the distribution of income and the ways one might be able to deal with that. And there are also questions about globalization, though I remain a supporter of globalization. So I do think there is an agenda to reform capitalism, which is a very important one. And I'm actually in the middle of another book, which I have had to put aside because of the crisis, which is called The Crisis of Democratic Capitalism. And that does deal at length with these various issues.
Will this crisis, in your view, accelerate the forces of economic nationalism and be a blow to the idea of economic globalization?
Yes. I was just going to say, now we have this crisis. How is that going to change this? I see very little evidence so far of a really radical desire to reform our economies. What is happening in many countries is resurgent nationalism, blame shifting, internationally and domestically, and one of the consequences you can see already, partly directly and indirectly, is a retreat from globalization, which was already well underway before the crisis started. So it's accelerating it, and I expect that it is very likely that we will be moving to a more nationalistic and protectionist world after this crisis, which I think will be a very bad thing, but it looks to me at the moment quite likely.
How, in such a situation where forces of economic nationalism are being strengthened, should India look at the issue of bolstering its exports? Because if our economy is to bounce back, then ensuring that we can strengthen our exports, which have been languishing for a while now, is a key economic imperative. How can we, A, be part of the idea of strengthening our own supply chains domestically, and yet ensure that because there will be a global reordering of supply chains, especially out of China, that a country like India can benefit from that, Mr. Wolf?
Well, you've, I think, got it correctly. First of all, I don't think there's any option but for India to continue to expand its exports. It's an imperative part of a rapidly growing economy. Exports have to grow at least as fast as the economy, and we want India to go back to fast growth, which was already a question before the crisis hit. And I think you got it right that there are real problems, but there are also opportunities here. The opportunity is one that India has pretty consistently not taken outside areas of services, which is to be part of the global supply chains in manufacturing. I'm not very optimistic that India will take these opportunities. By and large, other countries have been more successful in taking these opportunities, even after China was so extraordinarily successful. But there is again an opportunity. This would mean India would have to be consciously determined to open the economy, to make it immensely improve infrastructure, communications, the flexibility of the economy, so it could integrate itself into global supply chains in manufacturing as well as in services. There is a question about how viable manufacturing supply chains are going to be after this crisis. It's quite possible that a lot of these supply chains will actually be brought into the final markets. We don't know, but it seems to me that India simply has to try and see whether it can make a success of this. I don't think it will happen. I am rather fear that India will go back to a more inward-looking protectionist stance itself, which I think will be a profound error. But it is an opportunity. China's relations with the US are so bad. There is an opportunity here, and India should try to seize it.
What kind of economic recovery are you anticipating, Mr. Wolf? The IMF says that India will bounce back at 7.4% growth next year. Arvind Subramaniam, our former chief economic advisor, says that's too optimistic a scenario. Some analysts are worried about a W-like recovery, which means that there could be a double dip, so there may be a recovery, but if the infection comes back, we could slip again. What's your best sense of how the recovery globally and in particular in India is likely to be?
Well, globally, and this is where I differ from the IMF, it seems to me pretty clear that until we have got the pandemic completely under control globally, that's the important point, since we can be reinfected from anywhere, the world economy is not going to go back to normal. There will continue to be very tight restrictions on movement of people. Some of it will be voluntary. People just won't go to lots of places, and some of it will be government imposed. And there will be these tight controls within countries of various kinds and between countries. And that will be true as long as the virus is out there, effective, and we have no cure or no vaccine. There's a difference of opinion on how long that might be, but it could be up to nearly 2 years, in which case we're going to have a very, very weak recovery. If, of course, a vaccine comes through effectively much sooner than that, it transforms things, provided we can get it round the world. But I think the best estimate would be we're going to have a weak recovery. If we open up too quickly from the lockdowns, I think it will be W. That is to say, we'll have the economic activity will pick up a bit, the virus will start spreading again, and we will close down again. It will be very, very destabilizing. It's part of the reason I think it's such a mistake to think of it as containment versus the economy. But I expect this year will be terrible, worse than the IMF thinks, probably twice as bad, and next year will be a relatively weak recovery. After that, if we've got the disease well under control and we've been effective in containing the costs to business and society, then I think 2022, 23, 24 could see very strong recoveries in much of the world economy.
Did I hear you right when you said that you anticipate or you fear that the global economic contraction could be twice as bad as the International Monetary Fund has predicted?
Yes, the IMF itself has scenarios, very plausible scenarios, which make that the outcome. And in the developed world, could be much more than twice. I think most people who've looked at it carefully think the IMF is very much on the optimistic side, which is perfectly fair because they did these forecasts a few weeks ago, inevitably, and in a great hurry. So I think this is going to be a very, very deep depression. In this quarter, this year, our in the UK, Office of Budget Responsibility, has forecast that GDP in this country will decline 35%. And the recovery next 2 quarters, there will be there, but it won't mean that that will mean a massive overall shrinkage this year. And Britain, I think, is not in any way an exceptional developed country.
What do you think will be the future of oil? This week we saw West Texas immediate futures for May in the United States fall to less than $0. People were paying buyers if they would come and collect oil. How will this impact global oil prices, especially Brent, which is most important in the Indian context, in the short and medium term, in your view, sir?
Well, for India, I suppose this is a very good thing. You remain a large net oil importer, I believe. I think it is overwhelmingly probable that in the next couple of years, 3 years, oil prices will remain very, very, very low. Demand has been cut off massively. Supply elasticities are pretty modest, and that means that there's a glut. The shale oil business will close down. A lot of other oil producers will close down. That will remove capacity, and that will slowly bring back balance to the market. I wouldn't be at all surprised if someone told me that in 2025 or 2026, the prices have shot up well over $100 a barrel because the world economy will go back to normal. Consumption will go up. We don't have replacements for oil for very important functions, particularly transport, and a lot of potential capacity is going to disappear now. So I think the likelihood is we're going to have a few years of very, very low prices, followed by very unstable conditions, and then quite possibly very high prices. That's sort of been the history of oil. Exceptionally low prices were followed by very, very high prices, as happened in the late 90s into the early 2000s, and the reverse. And I think that's what's going to happen again now. But the next 2-3 years for a net importer of oil like India should be very good.
How does this pandemic impact the relationship between the existing global economic superpower, the United States, and the emerging or wannabe superpower, China? Who ultimately, according to you, will win the race to be the global economic superpower?
Very good question. Well, first of all, I think who wins that race is not going to be determined by this virus. It's going to be determined by policy and competence, broadly speaking. I've always felt that in the long run, unless the US performs quite extraordinarily, China is going to become much the biggest economy in the world because of its sheer scale. Now, that's not certain. Lots could go wrong with that, but there's a pretty good chance that's where it will end. The US ought to remain the dominant technological leader in the world, the most advanced economy in the world, but that can still go along with China being much bigger. The US success depends, however, on the quality of its leadership, and I fear that the current leadership of the United States is extraordinarily bad. In the current, bringing us to where we are now, how does this crisis affect it? Well, the most obvious thing it's affecting is the political relations between the two. The Chinese clearly messed up dramatically with the initial outbreak. They didn't inform the world of what was happening. They didn't seem to recognize it internally. There was colossal communication and policy failures. So they let it out. And though they then dealt with it brutally and effectively, of course, the whole world knows it came from China. And that is a huge minus in terms of China's credibility, obviously. Then now we've got the American reactions. It's clear the Americans don't know how to deal with this. There's turmoil in America, conflicts between the president and the state governors that are democratic, and failure to control the disease. So Mr. Trump is doing what Mr. Trump does. He's blaming foreigners. Above all, he's blaming China. So he's making his election campaign, it's clear, a big part of his election campaign will be anti-Chinese. And there are lots of other Americans by now who have become very hostile to China. So I do think that relations between the two superpowers, which will affect the long-term future of the world economy in the world, are going to be dramatically worsened by this event.
There's a growing demand in different countries of the world, especially in different states in the United States, where they're saying China must be made to pay for causing so much significant economic damage to the world. Do you believe, Mr. Wolf, that China must pay for this crisis?
I think that the history of reparations as a tool in international relations is utterly poisonous. You cannot impose reparations on a sovereign independent power. There's no way you could do it. And other than by defeating it in war, the most famous case of reparations of this kind in world history was Europe's the determination of the Western Allies to impose reparations on Germany after the First World War. This led to Hitler. Doesn't seem to me a very, very bright idea. I think the idea of reparations from China is absurd. But the idea that we have to investigate why this happened, what's happened, how we prevent anything like this ever happening again, whether it comes from China or somewhere else, bolstering our international systems of health and cooperation to deal with this, that idea, learning from this colossal series of errors, including very much China's, is essential. If we don't do that, we're doomed to repeat this, and the next pandemic might be much worse.
As I come towards the conclusion of this interview, I want to understand from you what, according to you, this pandemic will mean for the global job market going forward. There were already several trends around automation, artificial intelligence, machine learning that were playing themselves out. Those, of course, could accelerate. What are the other meta trends that you see, Mr. Wolf?
I think that when we've got through this, 5 years from now, 6 years from now, we'll probably find, in terms of the labor market, it has accelerated some tendencies, the most important of which is, I think, the realization how effective these remote working relations actually are, how easy it is, as this happened with our office. We now organize our entire office in the Financial Times with nobody going into the office. It's unthinkable, absolutely nobody. So I think that's a general phenomenon. There are a very large number of businesses, not all by many means. There are lots of things that require face-to-face contact, but things that can be organized remotely can and will be. And I think we've accelerated that dramatically by this experience. I expect, therefore, foreign travel will diminish somewhat. There will be a shift from face-to-face and the costs of transport and commuting to this sort of interaction. Beyond that, I think it's just part of the longer run trends we're getting in the changes of the structure of our economies and the step changes in technology. And I don't think it will be more than an accelerant in this particular aspect, provided we maintain a coherent world economy. If we fracture into the sort of mess that we got in the 1930s, then the economic consequences are completely impossible to predict and could be very, very bad.
Now, we've had a very stimulating conversation. I promised to free you in 30 minutes, so this is where I'll end this conversation. But I hope, Mr. Wolf, that we can have you back on our network for more insights as this crisis evolves and our response to it changes as well. Martin Wolf, world-renowned business commentator, economics editor for the Financial Times, for joining us on the India Today E-Conclave series. Thank you very much. Appreciate your time, sir.
Great pleasure.